My name is Carolina. I'm a sophomore at MIT, and we're really glad to have all of you guys here. This is the fourth talk of a six-part series happening on Tuesdays and Thursdays this month. And Reason for God is hosted by Crew at MIT, which is a student group that I'm involved in. If you're from another campus, it's really wonderful to have you here as well. Crew is a caring community where you can learn to explore your faith or grow in your faith if you are already a Christian. And we host Reason for God in order to create a space where we can engage some of the big questions about life and God. And at these events, we really welcome people from a whole spectrum of beliefs. So whether you're an atheist, a Christian, a member of another faith, whether you have a lot of doubts, whether you've been hurt by religion, really no matter where you are, this is a space where we can be honest about what we think and honest about our questions and doubts. And it's also a good place to disagree with what is said. We just ask that everyone be respectful and polite to one another. So before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you about a couple of things that are going to happen tonight. First, we'll have some Q&A. First, we'll hear from our speaker, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. And in the panel on the right of your screen, you should be able to see three columns, chat, participants, and Q&A. And so you can submit a question in the Q&A section, and you can upvote questions as you questions that you like to hear answered so that we know which ones are the most popular. And we'd really also like to prioritize hearing questions from students tonight. Of course, feel free to submit a question regardless of whether you're a student or not, but just be mindful of how many you're submitting and consider limiting them just to give everyone a chance. And also, please make sure to look at the other questions before you post one to avoid duplicates. If you see a question that's already been posted that's similar to yours, just upvote it so that we can answer it. And we would also kindly ask that you don't post your comments in the chat section. We're just going to leave that for announcements. In previous years, if you've ever been to one of these events in person, we would normally be eating dinner together in a big room, but for obvious reasons, we cannot do that this year. But instead, we'll be making a donation for each person who's here this evening to nonprofits that are providing food to those in need in the Boston and Cambridge area. So thank you so much for being here. And after our first three talks, we were able to give more than $835 to a local food pantry in Boston. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Mclaughlin. Dr. Mclaughlin grew up in the UK and holds a PhD in English literature from Cambridge and a theology degree from Oak Hill College in London. In September of 2017, she co-founded Vocable Communications, and Vocable is a speech-focused, data-driven communications firm dedicated to helping leaders deliver messages that change minds. Recently, she wrote Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, that was on the 2019 TED Summer Reading List, and was named 2019 Book of the Year by Christianity Today. She lives in Cambridge and is married and has 2 daughters and a son. And a fun fact about Dr. Mclaughlin is that she's a big fan of the show Schitt's Creek, as many of you might be, and you might be able to tell this by the t-shirt that she is wearing tonight. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mclaughlin to the stage.
Hello. Okay, I think I'll say that again. I said hi, everyone. It's great to weirdly, disembodiedly be here in the virtual form that we find ourselves these days. I had so much fun last year coming and speaking with you guys at an event like this in person, but we do our best. Oh, I don't know if anybody heard what I just said, so I'm going to move on. I live about 5 minutes walk from MIT. I strongly believe that MIT is much prettier as a campus than Harvard. And when my kids grow up, if I have to choose between them going to Harvard or MIT, I'm absolutely going to choose MIT, as you know. So as I wander around our neighborhood, and this is probably the case wherever you are, even if you're not actually on campus or near campus at the moment, in the last several months, I've seen a lot of yard signs which say something like this. In this house, we believe that Black Lives Matter, love is love, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, kindness is never wasted. I don't know if you've been noticing that these signs tend to have those first 3 claims, Black Lives Matter, love is love, and women's rights are human rights, somewhere on them, But there are sometimes other claims in there as well, like science is real or water is life. And what unites all the statements on these yard signs is a set of underlying beliefs. The belief that human beings are equally morally valuable, that women are equal to men, that racism is wrong, that the poor and oppressed and the marginalized can make real moral demands on the rich and strong and powerful, and that every human being should be free to love and be loved without coercion. For many, staking these signs in their yards is sort of like an act of protest. And for some, I think that protest is actually against Christianity. For reasons which, honestly, I understand, many people in my neighborhood today think that Christianity is the enemy of justice and equality and love. But I want to argue this evening that actually, far from standing against these things, Christianity is actually the soil in which all of these foundational moral beliefs about equality and justice grow. And that if we rip Christianity out of the equation, we're left not with a firmer secular foundation, we're actually left with an abyss. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in a very short time tonight, and I really look forward to the Q&A, because I'm sure there'll be many things that I haven't answered and many controversial claims I've made that you want to challenge, and I look forward to that. But to structure our time together, I'm going to make 4 points. I know you guys at MIT like numbers. So number 1, Christianity defines equality. Number 2, Christianity demands diversity. Number 3, Christianity explains sexuality. And number 4, Christianity motivates morality. So first, Christianity defines equality. I'm sure you guys all know the famous Declaration of Independence statement. It goes like this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is a foundational belief for people in our culture in the West today. And it seems to us like just basic moral common sense. But as the best-selling author and historian Yuval Noah Harari points out in his book, I don't know if you read it, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, it's actually not self-evident at all. Harari puts it like this: the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? Harari is pointing us back to the first chapter of the Bible, to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, which claims that there is one creator God and that this God made human beings, male and female, in his image. This is the original basis for the idea of universal human equality. And if this is not true, as Harari points out, then there is no basis for universal equality and human rights. Harari is an atheist Israeli historian, and he explains that human beings have no natural rights, just as spiders, hyenas, and chimpanzees have no natural rights. In fact, he says, belief in the unique worth and rights of human beings has embarrassingly little in common with the scientific study of Homo sapiens. So we can believe in human equality and rights if we like. But from an atheist perspective, as Harari declares, there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. In fact, there is no universal right and wrong at all. It was realizing this that turned a friend of mine who I knew from PhD days back in Cambridge from atheism to Christianity. My friend Sarah Irving, Stonebreaker, she was doing a PhD in the history of science. She's now a professor at a university in Australia where she comes from. And she grew up in Australia in a loving secular home where she was taught that human beings were all equally morally valuable and taught to believe in human rights, and that the poor and the weak and the marginalized actually deserved care and protection from the weak and the strong and the privileged. And then she went to a series of lectures. After she left Cambridge, she was doing a postdoc at Oxford University, and she went to a series of lectures by the world-famous atheist philosopher Peter Singer, who also comes from Australia, funnily enough, who now is based in the US. And as she listened to this world-class atheist philosopher speak, she realized that her atheism actually stuck a knife into the back of all her deepest moral beliefs. And gradually, as she recognized that the things that she had held to be self-evident were not self-evident at all, but in fact specific inheritances from Christianity, she ended up becoming a Christian when she was 28 years old as an assistant professor of history. Back in my homeland, British historian Tom Holland is going through actually a similar process right now. So he wrote this very fat and very interesting book called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And Tom Holland himself stopped believing in Christianity as a kid. He'd grown up in the UK in a sort of culturally Christian environment. But frankly, he was much more attracted by the heroes of the Greek and Roman myths than he was by the sort of hero of the Christian faith who died on a Roman cross. But as he was researching for this massive book on the history of Christianity, he came to realize that things that we see as basic moral beliefs today, whether we identify ourselves as Christians or not, that these have come to us from Christianity. Because as he argues, at the heart of Christianity is the most powerful man ever to have lived, dying a brutal, agonizing, shameful death, because he loved the weak and the poor and the helpless so much that he was willing to die for them. Jesus' life, death, and teachings, according to Tom Holland, literally changed the world, because he showed that the poor and the weak and the oppressed are actually at the very heart of God's moral concern for our universe. So according to multiple professional historians, whether they are self-identified atheists like Yuval Noah Harari, atheists turned Christians like my friend Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, or Tom Holland, who is kind of, I think, very close to actually acknowledging that he is a Christian after this sort of strange process that he's been through. They all agree that actually these beliefs have come to us, are kind of the building blocks of our morality have come to us from Christianity, whether we realize it or not. So that's my first point. Christianity defines equality. My second point is perhaps even more surprising and sort of brings us back to the yard sign. And it's that Christianity demands diversity. Given the history of white Christian nationalism in America and the ugly ways in which it's been manifesting itself even recently here, not to mention the history of colonialism in my own country, it's easy to assume that Christianity is at heart a white Western religion. In fact, many of the Black Lives Matter, many times that claim is spoken, it's spoken sort of in protest against that mentality, against the history of white Westerners in general, and actually white Christians in particular, treating Black Americans like their lives didn't matter. From slavery to segregation to racial inequality today. And there is much to be lamented here, much in Christian terms, much sin to be repented of. There are two major problems with the hypothesis that Christianity is at heart a white Western religion of oppression. Two problems. The first is the Bible, and the second is the global church today. So looking at the first, starting with that claim in Genesis 1 that we looked at a few minutes ago, that God created all human beings, regardless of their race or sex or place or origin, in his image. We start from there as we look at the Bible, and then we see this extraordinary vision that works its way out through the passages of the scriptures from beginning to end that call us to a vision of diversity in which people from every race and language and people group are called to live in community together. In fact, the Bible is actually the original source of that idea of love across racial and ethnic difference. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible as a text, maybe not at all, but you may know that in the book of Genesis, God calls a man named Abraham, and starts a sort of particular relationship with him and with his descendants. And Abraham came from a place which in modern day terms is in Iraq, so not a white Westerner at all to start with. And God made promises to Abraham that through him and his offspring, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And as we read through the stories of Abraham's family in Genesis and Exodus and following in the Bible, we see people of all sorts of different ethnicities actually being woven into that family tree, including very early on, people from Africa. And when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history in what we call the New Testament, we see that he is the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. He's this promised offspring through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. And we see Jesus breaking through every racial and cultural barrier of his day. And then after his death and resurrection, commanding his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. We then read in the book of Acts, one of the New Testament books, which tells us the story of the very first churches. We read the story of the birthday of the church, sort of day one of the church, when God pours his spirit out on his people. And we see there, quote, people from every nation under heaven putting their faith in Jesus, and specifically as listed, people from places that are in modern day Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, and Libya. So Christianity was radically multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial from the first. And let's be clear, this is not a kind of separate but equal junk, as per segregation in America. The vision that the New Testament gives us is of Christians being one body together across all of these kinds of differences, being one family. And in the book of Revelation, at the very end of the Bible, we see this vision of people from every tribe and tongue and nation worshiping Jesus together. So this, if you're a Christian today, this is your destiny. But it's also in tangible ways, as we look around the world, it's becoming a reality. 40 years ago, sociologists of religion thought that as the world, as the globe became more modern, more educated, more scientific, that religious belief would naturally decline. But that prophecy failed. Today, Christianity remains the largest global belief system and also actually the most diverse. So about 31% of all humans identify as Christians today. And in terms of where they live, roughly equal numbers live in Europe, in North America, in South America, and in Africa. And right now, the church in China is growing so fast, despite sort of government opposition, that experts believe that there'll be more Christians in China than in America by 2025. And some experts think that by 2060, China could be a majority Christian country. By that point as well, it's thought that about 40% of the world's Christians will be living in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's likely that in my lifetime, I'll live to see Black Christians globally being the largest racial group among Christians. And if that isn't true, it will only be because the church in China has sort of grown beyond even current, possible expectations. If we look at America as well, we see that the folks most likely to be Christian in America are Black Americans, and actually Black women in particular. Whereas the folks more likely to be atheists are white men. So if you care about diversity, and my guess is everybody in this sort of virtual room does, don't dismiss Christianity. Because despite the racist history of white Christians, looking very much like me, Christianity remains the greatest movement for diversity in all of history. Why? Because the Bible teaches that universal equality of all humans, and then calls humans, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, into a family of faith with a brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jewish man as the head and the heart. So that's my second point. Christianity grounds diversity. My third point may sound even more strange. It's that Christianity explains sexuality. Now, what on earth do I mean by this? Well, I'll just confuse you a little bit more to begin with. I don't know how many of you read the Harry Potter series. If you haven't, you probably need to block your ears for the next couple of minutes. But right now I'm reading Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince with my girls who are 10 and 8. And we're reading it for the second time because we love it so much. And we're at the point, I don't know if you haven't read the series, this won't make a whole lot of sense to you, but if you have it, it will. We're coming towards the point when Snape kills Dumbledore. You probably remember the exact scene. It's completely devastating because up until that point in the story, we don't know if Snape's on the side of good with Dumbledore or on the side of evil with Voldemort. He's sort of a double agent for one side or the other, and we don't actually know which, but we know that Dumbledore trusts Snape. But then in his penultimate book, a weakened Dumbledore stands at the top of the astronomy tower, surrounded by his enemies, and he appeals to Severus Snape for help. He says, "Severus, please." And Snape kills him. Now, the scene is completely devastating. We never liked Professor Snape, but we hope beyond hope that he was Dumbledore's man, and now his betrayal of his mentor is complete. It's only in the last book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, we realise how wrong we were. When Harry extracts memories from the dying Snape's mind and pours them into the pensieve, that magical bowl where you dive into somebody else's past, now we discover that everything that Snape has done has been motivated by his passionate, hopeless, unrequited love for Harry's mother. We see Snape's anguish when Lily Potter is murdered by Voldemort, and how he thenceforth commits himself to Dumbledore. We hear Dumbledore telling Snape that he is dying from the slow workings of an irreversible curse and making Snape to promise that he will kill him when the moment comes. And suddenly, the meaning of Severus, please, is completely reversed. And many in our culture today see Christianity as the villain when it comes to sexuality. The Christian insistence on sex as belonging only in marriage between one man and one woman seems today not only outdated, but actually also immoral, oppressive, hateful, in a world where sexual freedom is highly prized, and where, as the yard sign puts it, love is love. But I want to suggest that like Snape's story, when we look more closely at Christian sexual ethics and what the Bible says, it's actually not a story of hate. It's a story of love. And that rather than trampling on our sexuality, Christianity explains it and gives it a deeper meaning. You see, according to the Bible, there is a loving creator God who made us human beings in his image and deeply desires relationship with us. We've all turned away from him, something that the Bible calls sin, which explains why the world we live in is such a god-awful mess. But nonetheless, God loves us and wants to be close to his people. And so to show us what it means when he says that he loves us, he's actually built pictures of love into our lived experience as humans. So again, I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible, but you may be aware that Christians talk about God as their father. And if you think about it, God didn't have to create humans by us having to have a father and a mother. He did that intentionally. He could have made us like amoebas that just sort of reproduce asexually, or the snake in the St. Louis Zoo last year, a female snake that managed to lay a bunch of eggs without a male. So if you think about the fact that God, according to the Christian claim, God actually created the universe out of nothing, could have done it all sorts of ways, but he deliberately made these particular kinds of relationships. And according to the Bible, he did that so that the absolute best human father will give us a tiny glimpse of what he means when he says that he loves us. The Bible also actually compares God to a breastfeeding mother and says, if you think a mother loves her nursing infant, I love you more than that. And similarly, if we look at what the Bible has to say about sexuality, we find that our sexuality is also designed so that at its very best, it can give us a glimpse of Jesus' love for us. So time and again in the Old Testament, God talks about himself as a loving, faithful husband, and Israel as an often unfaithful wife who's always sort of cheating on him with other gods. And when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history, he calls himself the bridegroom. Sort of weird claim to make, unless you know that history. And then when the Apostle Paul, one of the first Christian leaders, was writing to one of the first churches in Turkey at a place called Ephesus, he explains that the whole point of Christian marriage is to be like a little scale model for Jesus' love for his church. That is why Christian marriage is male-female, because it's actually a love across difference. It's why Christian marriage is built on sacrifice. Paul says that just like Jesus died on the cross for us, so husbands are to give themselves up for their wives. And like Christ in the church, Christian marriage is designed to be a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. So marriage is actually meant to point us to Jesus. But it's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the very best human marriage could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. Now, it's easy for us to imagine that the sexual revolution of the 1960s and everything that's sort of happened since then was the first time that this sort of idea of marriage being between one man and one woman was really challenged. And that was sort of the default setting that in recent decades has been challenged. But actually, if you look again historically, and Tom Holland is very interesting on this as well, in the Greco-Roman world, men were not expected to be faithful to their wives. It's fine for them to sleep with other women. It was actually fine for them to sleep with other men as well. The Roman Emperor Nero, who ruled during the time that much of the New Testament was written, got married to two other men on two separate occasions, in one instance dressed as a woman himself. Now, he was a crazy man in many ways. So I'm not saying that everything that he did was necessarily like normative for the culture of the time, but it actually was illustrative of the range of sexual options that were open to Roman men of that day. Certainly not the same kinds of options to women. But in that first century culture, it's really weird that Christians insisted on what we now look at as Christian marriage between one man and one woman, there was an expectation of faithfulness, not just of the wife, but actually of the husband as well. And Christian men, it was very strange, were called to either be faithful to one woman or to live as, like the Apostle Paul did, as a single person and not have sex with anyone. And yet, despite all of this sort of strange exclusivity, the Bible calls for love between Christians of the same sex that is so strong that the Apostle Paul talks about as being one body together. He talks about us being brothers and sisters. He talks about us being fellow soldiers. And even at one point, he's writing about a friend of his named Onesimus, and he calls him his very heart. The Bible isn't against same-sex love. It actually calls Christians to a profound level of love and connection between members of the same sex. But it gives them a different space for that than the sexual space that is very exclusively confined to marriage. So instead of saying love is love, the Bible says that God is love, and that he shows us what that means through different kinds of human relationship. Now, this has been particularly meaningful to me. I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember. I've also been attracted to women for as long as I can remember. If I wasn't a Christian, I think it's highly likely that I would be married to a woman today rather than to a man. But within the Christian framework, as I've said, like sexual and romantic fulfillment isn't the pinnacle of human existence. It's not the point. It's actually a signpost to something much greater, a much deeper, a much more intimate love. It's a signpost to a relationship with Jesus. So that's our third point. Christianity, in its crazy way, I agree, explains sexuality. And our fourth and final point is this: Christianity motivates morality. When my fellow countryman, the atheist author and scientist Richard Dawkins, looks out at the world, he sees a universe that has precisely the properties we would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He sees a world where there is no underlying moral fabric to the universe. No wrong, no right, no evil, and no good. Yuval Noah Harari, as I mentioned earlier, agrees. Morality is a product of our common imagination, and it can change over time. There's nothing intrinsically good from this perspective about caring for the poor or not committing murder. Evolution, if we're blunt and honest, doesn't tell us that rape is wrong, or that we should care about people in completely different tribes and cultures. The ancient Greeks and Romans honestly would have laughed at all of these ideas. We believe these things, as I mentioned earlier, because of the massive impact that Christianity has had upon the world. And in his most recent book, Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, Richard Dawkins actually himself acknowledges the wealth of data that shows that people who are actively religious actually behave on average in much more pro-social ways than those who don't. Now Dawkins says, it seems a little patronizing to say, well, you and I are much too clever to really believe in these religious things, but we're really glad that other people do, because it does seem to make them behave better. But actually, if we look at the data, as philosopher Christian Miller observes, who wrote a book on character, literally hundreds of studies have linked religious participation to better moral outcomes, including greater generosity to others, less likelihood of committing crimes, etc. The really strange thing about the Christian faith, and I know we've talked about a number of strange things, but it's this, that the Christian faith doesn't say follow Jesus and he'll make you a better person. It says you and I haven't a hope in hell of being good people. If people knew our thoughts, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, even when we look like we're doing good, they'd see our selfishness and greed and envy and lust and meanness. Not that we never do anything good, but if I'm brutally honest, even when I am doing good things that other people would commend me for, if I look at myself, I can see the ways in which I have a whole bunch of poor motives mixed in with that. And that's even before we've talked about the things that I do that are just blatantly not good. And according to the Christian faith, the one person who actually can see our thoughts and the one person who has the right to judge us came to give his life so that we could be forgiven and put back into that relationship with God. A relationship with God so intense that even the most passionate human romance cannot hold a candle to it. So for followers of Jesus like me, the motivation to do good is not to earn God's favor. I'll never be good enough to do that. It's actually knowing that I already have God's favor, not because of what I've done, but because of what Jesus did for me. Knowing that I have been forgiven, knowing that I am eternally and utterly loved by the one person who gave up everything for me. That is what motivates me to be willing to give up things for other people. You see, if we put our trust in Jesus, whether we are joyful or depressed, whether we are married or single, sexually fulfilled or hurting, loved or lonely, the end of our story will be unbelievably good. Success or failure, health or sickness, popularity or isolation, none of this will matter in the end. The only thing that will matter is if we've turned and put our trust in Jesus, who not only motivates morality, but also shows us what it meant to truly live a good life. So doesn't Christianity hinder morality? Controversially, I've argued no. Number one, because Christianity defines equality. Number two, Christianity demands diversity. Number three, Christianity explains sexuality. And number four, Christianity motivates morality. We've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short time. And as I said at the beginning, I'm sure that there are many things I've said that have been offensive or confusing or just lots of gaps. And I look forward to Q&A. Be glad to answer or attempt to answer any questions that you have. But I just want to end by saying this: whoever you are, whatever you've done, however you feel, whatever you think about everything that I've just said thus far, God loves you with an unbelievable love. The kind of love that you've dreamed of all your life. A love that took Jesus to the cross and back for you because he wants you in his family today. And the yard signs say that love is love. The Bible says that God is love and that we know what love is because Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. That's the heart of the Christian message. It doesn't hinder morality, it defines it. So I said I'd love to take any questions you have, and I think Carolina's going to come and organize that for us.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. McLaughlin. That was really great. So now we're going to move into a time of Q&A. As mentioned earlier, I'll be reading the questions to Dr. McLaughlin from the Q&A section in descending order of upvote. So if everyone could please take a moment to upvote your favorite questions and add new ones as we go along. And as a reminder, just look at all the questions before submitting yours so that we avoid duplicate questions and just upvote the ones that are similar to you. And make sure to vote on the questions you would most like to see answered. Great. So we're going to start with the top question right now. I think we have a tie. I'll start with the one that's on the top of my screen. Okay. Now we're at 4. Great. So I think this question is diving right into this topic. Can't same-sex parents of adopted children still give us a glimpse of God's love, just like another father's love can also give us a glimpse of God's love?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and what I'd say in answer to that is a yes and no. So first I want to say yes. Many people have grown up with same-sex parents who have truly and sacrificially loved them. And if and when they come to the Bible with that framework in their minds, and they see that God loves them like a father, if they have 2 fathers, or that God loves them like a breastfeeding mother, if they have 2 mothers, certainly they will see that and they will think, oh, I kind of have a category in my mind for that. Conversely, just as a side note, I'm sure many people in this room have, whether their parents were opposite sex or same sex, I'm sure many people in this room grew up with parents who really let them down, with fathers who were absent or abusive, with mothers who didn't have time for them or massively burdened them emotionally. I'm sure many people in this room will have had experiences with parents that honestly make it hard for them to read the Bible and hear that God is like a father. And when all of us with our sort of broken family backgrounds of whatever form come to the Bible, it's not saying that our human experience kind of limits how we can understand God's love. It's saying that the absolute best picture of this will give us a tiny glimpse of how God loves us. So those who've had absent or abusive fathers, for example, can come to the Bible and think, you know what, my dad totally let me down. And this is telling me about a father who won't do that. So number one, yes, absolutely. People who've grown up with same-sex parents could have had that experience. But I sort of want to say no as well, because one of the really challenging things I think about Christianity for us as modern 21st century Westerners is the idea that God actually has the right to tell us what to do. We have a deeply ingrained in us this idea that the more freedom we have, the happier we'll be. I feel like we're lectured on that from infancy almost. Again, the data doesn't show that at all. It shows that actually unlimited freedom makes us humans quite miserable. We need some freedom, but not half as much as we think that we do. And one of the most controversial claims of Christianity, as I say, is that the Bible actually has the right to tell us what to do, including the right to tell us what to do with our bodies sexually. And people sometimes think, well, why would God care what I do with my body sexually? And I sort of think, well, do you care? Like, if we're talking about a personal God who deeply loves you, of course he cares about your sex life. Of course he cares about your most intimate relationships. And consistently through the Bible, we see same-sex sexual relationships being seen as sinful and outside of what God's calling his people to. Now, I want to be clear again on that. Actually, if we read the Bible, we find that there are many of the first Christians came to Jesus out of backgrounds where they were in same-sex sexual relationships. And every time that's spoken about in the New Testament, all other forms of what the Bible talks about as sexual immorality are talked about as well. And so this is not a sort of special sin in its own special category from a Christian perspective at all, actually. But as I say, one of the sort of really hardest to swallow claims of Christianity is that God does have the right to tell us what to do, and that he has woven into our experience this picture of husband and wife, and that's how he's also designed us to be able to reproduce. So that's a kind of messy answer in some ways, and I realize, deeply offensive to many people, frankly, in some ways offensive to me as someone who's always been more attracted to women than to men. But yeah, one of the things that Christianity calls us to is to surrender everything to Jesus. So in the area of sexuality as well.
So yeah, thank you. I think that really is sort of the heart of some of the issues people have with this entire subject. And going off of that, I think there's another question I'm going to ask because it relates to this topic. Is why does God only call us to this asexual love with people of the same sex, and why not the same high pure love plus sexual intimacy? So I think that's getting at when you were discussing sort of this brotherly, sisterly love that we're called to have with people of the same sex, and then how that's different from the love we have with people of the opposite sex. But why can't we just have both?
Yeah, and again, some of what I've said, I think touches on the kind of the gospel story, or the fundamental reason why God actually made us male and female in the first place, and why he has called us into, in as much as we are called to sexual relationships, which is certainly not what everyone's called to as Christians, that he's called us into that across the male-female difference, is to model that picture of Jesus and the church being different from each other, right? So in the Bible, the church is sort of pictured as female, in contrast to Jesus as male. Now, again, one of the difficult things, or the challenging things, though I think it's ultimately liberating about being a Christian, is that actually God doesn't have to justify himself to us on every point. I don't know if you are familiar with the first few chapters of the Bible. There's a story about the first humans, the man and the woman, they're called, later sort of named Adam and Eve. And God gives them one commandment. He says, don't eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, that wasn't like a sort of intuitive law, right? It wasn't like, don't kill each other, or don't, tear all the trees down in the garden. It was, don't eat the fruit from this tree. And when the woman was sort of being tempted to eat that fruit, it was like, well, it looks good. Doesn't look, but like intuitively, there was nothing telling her, actually, this isn't good. Everything was telling her, oh, this looks great. And so the man and the woman disobeyed. And that's sort of seen as like a paradigmatic story for Christians of how the world has gone completely wrong. So there are things that I can say, and some things that I have said, to sort of give us a sense of the logic that behind this to say, strange Christian sexual ethics, which has been strange from day one. But at the end of the day, the answer is because that's what God has said. And again, within the Christian framework, the Genesis talks about God creating the universe through what he says. So, and we see in the Gospels, Jesus raising people from the dead simply by telling them to come out of their graves. So in order to become a Christian, one of the ways in which we have to humble ourselves actually is to say, you know what? God is God and I'm not. And he actually has the right to tell me what to do. He created me, so he knows what's best for me. And I think we as humans struggle to believe that God has our best interests at heart. But according to the Bible, he really does.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great response. I think another question that relates to just the same topic is, biblically, mentions of sexual immorality seem to revolve around adultery and being unfaithful. I don't think the focus is on same-sex relationships, for example, but rather infidelity. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. It's very true that there is, strong New Testament prohibitions against adultery. And again, it's actually the picture, as we saw in the Old Testament, is that God's people are all sort of running away from him, and like that's pictured metaphorically as sort of sleeping with other gods. And absolutely, it's true that adultery is a really big deal from a Christian perspective. At the same time, there are multiple texts, and it's not just one text that can kind of be easily explained away. And as I say, as someone who's always been a Christian and has always been attracted to women, I would have been quite happy to study more of the Bible. And I learned Greek and Hebrew in seminary. I'd been pleasantly surprised, like quite happy to have discovered that actually marriage between two women was just fine. My best friend as well came to Christ when she was an undergrad at Yale, from a background where she was not a Christian at all, hadn't been raised a Christian. She identified as an atheist. She'd started a sexual relationship with another girl when she was 15, and had multiple other sort of sexual relationships with both men and women to just sort of check that she really was into girls and not guys. And yes, she definitely was. And it wasn't until her girlfriend broke up with her in college and she ended up sort of accidentally finding out more about Christianity that she became intrigued by who Jesus was. And she first went and consulted a couple of friends who are the only people who are identifying as Christians that she knew, who were a lesbian couple. And they said, don't worry, actually the Bible is quite, we've just been misunderstanding it for all these years. And really same-sex marriage, absolutely works with following Jesus. And she was very happy to hear this, read the little booklet they'd given her, thrilled by what she saw. And then she started looking at the Bible, what the Bible actually says itself. And she was super disappointed because it just didn't match up. And years later, having studied Greek and Hebrew much better than I do, and really looked into all of the sort of possible nuances much more closely than I have, it still concludes that actually, one of the things that same-sex attracted people like me have to give up as they become a Christian, or that they daily sacrifice as followers of Jesus, is that particular kind of sexual and romantic fulfillment. But one of the things that Jesus tells us is that anyone who wants to come after him must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. And that anyone who wants to save their life will lose it, whereas the one who loses their life for his sake will find it. So there's a sort of strange inversion that goes on in following Jesus, that you need to be ready to give up everything, but actually the life that you have in Christ is so much more than anything you could ever have had.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a super great point, because it's important to remember that, like, regardless of whether you're experiencing the issue of same-sex attraction or another thing that you're struggling with, everyone is giving up something, and a lot of things actually, to become a Christian and to follow Jesus. One question that I would ask that sort of like maybe relates some of these other questions is that I have a lot of friends who are part of the LGBTQ community, and they just really feel like Christianity is sort of unreachable for them because they just don't see people like them, or people they identify with this community, and they don't see people like that represented in Christianity, because of what the Bible says about these things. What would you say to those people, like they're sort of who are really interested but just feel that this way that they excludes them entirely from faith?
Yeah. I mean, well, so first what I would say is there have been many instances when Christians have acted in actually thoroughly un-Christian ways toward gay and lesbian folk. I remember actually, I think it was at this event last year when the Q&A, somebody asked me, why have Christians acted hatefully toward gay and lesbian people? And I was like, honestly, I can answer that with one word: sin. The sin of Christians, actually, in how they've treated other people, both inside the church and outside the church. So the first thing I want to say is, like, there is so much that Christians like me need to repent of in this area. But secondly, if somebody lives in Cambridge, I'd say, hey, come to church with me on Sunday. I've always been more attracted to women, as I've said, and I truly would. I'm happily married to a man, and there's actually a bunch of research done by a lesbian professor at University of Utah to show that the idea that people are sort of either straight or gay is actually a massive oversimplification, and actually there's much more sort of wibbly-wobbliness of various sorts than we've historically acknowledged. Which again, if you watch the show Schitt's Creek that this shirt comes from, you'll see some of that pictured. But I'd say, yeah, come to church with me on Sunday. So there's me, my best friend who came to Christ straight out of a lesbian relationship. Another really good friend of mine, Lou, who is a Christian man who has since being an early teenager, always been attracted to guys and not girls, and so serves the Lord as a single man and as a dear brother in Christ. I won't mention their specific names, but a friend of mine has a couple of kids who are intersex. Totally different scenario, but just to say, like, we actually have a kind of, without intending it, among my close friends at my local church, I have people who, where they're not Christians, would be identified as gay, lesbian, and intersex. Again, different from transgender in meaningful ways, but we have a little community going on there. So I just say, like, come and see. You're welcome. We would love to have you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that answer. I think that's something that a lot of people really need to hear. So that's wonderful. Sort of switching topics just a little bit. The top question we have right now is, universal moral worth predates Christianity/Judaism. Therefore, to say that all human ideas of universal moral worth are based in Jainism and not Christianity.
So here, all I can say here is that the professional historians who are not Christians who have looked into this would say that actually the kind of ethics that we have inherited today is from Christianity. So again, I don't claim to be a personal expert on the history of thought, but from multiple sources who have written long, extensive books about this, I think that's the reality.
Yeah, the idea is that universal moral worth might not actually predate Christianity. Is that what you're sort of getting at? Or?
Well, often it depends exactly what the moral worth is. So people will often say that within all religions and belief systems, there's this idea that, you know, Jesus was famous for saying, love your neighbor as yourself. And but there's this idea of kind of moral sort of reciprocity within all belief systems. And there's some truth in that, but it actually misses the massive way in which Jesus kind of exploded that out. Because the question is, who is your neighbor? And in most belief systems, there's an idea that you should treat a certain group of people in a certain way. You know, maybe it's sort of male citizens or whatever it is. But that there'll be other people actually for whom you don't need to have a moral concern. And that this will play itself out in different ways. But Jesus, in his famous parable of the Good Samaritan, when he was asked, like, who's my neighbor? He told a story in which the hated racial and ethnic group, like a member of that group, was the moral hero who went and bound up the wounds of a Jewish man who'd been beaten and left by the side of the road when two sort of highly religious Jewish leaders had walked past and not bothered at all. So the radical thing that Christianity does is that it says, actually, the people to whom you are kind of bound morally are actually, that's everyone. That's people not only in your family, not only in your national group, not only in your sort of socio-economic demographic, but in particular, the people who are none of those things, the people you were raised to hate, those are the people, from a Christian perspective, you are most called to love.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer, I think. So I think the next question is, people could be good or moral without believing in God, but can a person get moral obligation from an atheistic framework or worldview?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So the first statement, people can be good or moral without believing in God. Again, I'd say yes and no. Because what does it mean? If to take this from another angle, we talked about the fact that from the perspective of Yuval Harari, Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. So that there's the idea that really it's only moral consensus, like there is no justice and no human rights beyond the kind of common moral imagination of a certain group of people at a certain time. To sort of drill down to that even further, Alan Lightman, who I think is still a professor at MIT, certainly was a few years ago in physics and also teaching creative writing there. Remember, he was asked his worldview at an event I was at a few years ago, and he said, our consciousness and our self-awareness creates the illusion that we have some sort of ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. So from a properly kind of consistent, non-theistic perspective, if there is no God, you and I aren't actually even like real moral agents. We are temporary collections of atoms and molecules. So who cares what happens to us? Who cares what we do to each other? It's just like shuffling around some stuff, some gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. So that statement, people can do good without believing in God. Yes, in the sense that somebody who, for example, who is not a Christian could absolutely care for a poor or homeless person. And that would be something that from a Christian perspective is like a morally good thing to do, yes. But actually, if we properly kind of get our heads around the not belief in God bit, there's no such thing as good and evil. We're just like a bunch of atoms and molecules. So then the second part of this question, can a person get moral obligation from an atheistic framework worldview? Again, yes and no. I know it's really annoying. I keep answering yes and no. Atheists can and do create moral frameworks and commit to live according to them. Question is there any underlying reason for those moral frameworks? Or, like Hitler came up with an ethical framework that he lived by and wanted other people to live by. I think it's profoundly evil. But I can actually only say that it was profoundly evil because I think there is something like an objective moral standard that it falls utterly short of. But if there isn't, if it's really just like, we can all, we could actually each come up with our own moral frameworks, or we could decide as a community, here, everybody on this call today, we're going to have, this is going to be our ethics. That's all we have from an atheist perspective, actually. So yes, you can create a set of sort of somewhat arbitrary rules that you ask people to keep, but there's no deep connection between that and what human beings are, which is what I think the Judeo-Christian tradition offers us.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great breakdown of the different parts of that question and a good answer to it. The next question asks, if the American ideal of equality is Christian-based, as you said, then why is the Bible not used as a source for this reasoning? The Constitution, the Declaration, Federalist Papers don't use the Bible. It's only used, they only reference philosophers and historians.
Yeah, great question. And this actually connects up to something that Tom Holland, I'm now using this book as a computer rest, talks about. There have been a few generations of this. So firstly, I would slightly question that they don't use the Bible at all, because that line, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. I'm not even American, and I know this, so I'm kind of pleased with myself. Okay. So it's not that there is no foundational sense of God, and that wouldn't have been assumed to have been, broadly speaking, a Christian God. But I think there are many, clearly, hate to say this, but it's true, clearly the founding documents of America and the way that they were interpreted at the time are absolutely sub-biblical, because they classified Black Americans as subhuman. And that is something, as I said, the Bible is completely against. But we see the first African Christian, an Ethiopian man, coming to Jesus in the book of Acts, like the story of the very first Christians there. So I would slightly question that there is no sort of sense of rooting this in the Christian tradition. But one of the things that Tom Hollander is very interesting on is explaining how, through various sort of paths and generations, and in particular looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the specifically Christian roots of all of these ideas have sort of been quite deliberately swept under the carpet. Because if you think about it, with something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was put together after the horrors of the Second World War, as the sort of West was reeling from the fact that something truly horrific had happened in a highly sort of developed and sophisticated, scientifically literate culture, etc., very like ours in many ways, and trying to come up with a set of basic moral beliefs that could be adopted by people in all sorts of different countries, including countries where Christianity wasn't the majority religion. And so very intentionally, they had to sort of hide the fact that these ideas came from Christianity. And again, I mean, Tom Holland wasn't a Christian writing this book, so he's not sort of motivated to say, "Oh, this is really Christian ideas." But they actually were. And the reason that, like, part of the reason it's been so sort of successful is actually because it's been, the Christian roots of it has been somewhat hidden. But still, at the time, I mean, we forget. It's easy for us to think that the main competitors of Christianity is sort of secularism, where we live in America today. Actually, the main competitor of Christianity globally is Islam. And a number of Muslim countries didn't sign up to the Declaration of Human Rights because they were like, this is Christian stuff and we cannot get on board with it. We actually have our own, we have a very different set of moral laws, and this is incompatible with Sharia law. So I think we need to, it's interesting historically, but I think we need to be real about the fact that actually Christianity has developed a lot of our thinking, even when we think that we're sort of reacting against it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great points. The next question I'm going to ask is not the top, but I think it is really relevant to this issue. With theism, isn't good or moral just whatever God decides? And as you said, God doesn't have to explain himself to us, so why would God's interests necessarily coincide with my and your idea of flourishing?
Yes, great question. So part one, with theism, isn't good or moral just whatever God decides? Yes. It's again, one of the sort of startling claims of Christianity is that it's not that there was a sort of independent set of moral laws somewhere that God happened upon and thought, oh yeah, I'll do that. Just as we believe as Christians that God created the universe and that he's completely free, so he could create it any way he liked, that he created it a certain way, running according to certain laws of nature. And actually, if you look at the history of science, you find that it was Christians who first developed the modern scientific method because they believed in the God of the Bible. He is both rational and free. Philosopher of science at Princeton, Hans Halvorsen, is very interesting on this point. But yeah, so what God says is good, and what God says is evil. However, the good news for us is that the Bible tells a story of a God who not only created the world, he didn't sort of create the world and then sort of go off and have coffee. He actually created the world wanting to create people like us to have a relationship with him. And so the moral fabric of the universe is such that people like us truly thrive living into it. And how do I know that he has our best interests at heart? Well, Jesus. Because according to Jesus, if we believe what the Bible says about Jesus, God loved us to such an extent that he sent his son to die for us. So, and that's kind of what I need to come back to. Anytime I feel like, gosh, it feels really hard to do what God's calling me to do right now, or like I would frankly prefer not to, or I don't understand God's moral reasoning in this area or that area. The question we must ask is can we trust the person who's giving us this command? It's actually interesting. I don't know how many of you have kids, probably not many. I have a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And one of the things that I'm working really hard to teach them is that sometimes they just need to do what I say because I have said it. And they need to trust that I love them and I know better than they do. And it's actually really important for their safety that they know that, because sometimes I will say, stop. And they have to stop that minute rather than saying, Mummy, why should I stop? I'm enjoying running right now. Well, there's a car coming and I don't have time to explain that to you. Or, if I said to them, you need to jump out of the window right now, they look at me and think, okay, this woman has loved me since I was born. She's far from perfect, but I have a strong track record to know that she loves me and that she has my best interest at heart. And if she's asking me to jump out the window, there must be a reason for it, and she must not have time to tell me why. And so I think sometimes as we kind of approach how God speaks to us morally, we're kind of like little children who first, when we hear our dad say, do this, we need to do it. He may explain, he may not, but actually we know that he has our best interests at heart because he's our father.
Thank you. I think that's a great response. I think the next question also just gets sort of a little bit about how we can trust God. And why do we think that God/Jesus is the basis of love when he kills many people? Isn't it more reasonable to think that the ground is probably something that didn't kill anyone?
Yeah, a great question. So my guess is that this is referring to the fact that in the Old Testament, there are times when God commands his people to go and conquer another nation, or to go and he sends them in judgment on another nation. And actually also, conversely, he'll sometimes send other nations in judgment on his people.
Yes.
There's a fundamental kind of biblical principle, which, and we've alluded to it somewhat already, that actually God is the one person who has the right of life or death over everyone and anyone. And so, for example, in the New Testament, when it teaches that Christians must not take revenge on their enemies, the reason is not that there will never be justice. The reason is it's actually God's job to mete out justice, and not ours. Like we actually need to be, it says if your enemy is hungry, give him some food. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. But that's our role in this picture. So the God, and why does God have right of life or death over any of us? Who is he to say that we should live or die? He's the one who created us. Again, it sort of comes back to that. Now, isn't it more reasonable to think that the ground for perfect love is somebody who didn't kill anyone? I guess I'd flip that around to say, according to the Bible, that the picture of perfect love is somebody who came to die. Who came to be killed themselves so that others could live. And that's what we see in the person of Jesus, somebody sort of willingly going to their own death, knowing it from the first, and taking on himself not only the kind of brutal pain of Roman torture, because the cross was designed to maximize torture and humiliation, but actually also, according to the Bible, taking on himself God's judgment on our sin. So the basis for love, and John, one of Jesus' first followers, says it in one of the letters in the New Testament, and this is how we know what love is, that Jesus Christ gave up his life for us. So also we should lay down our lives for each other.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a great answer to that question. And that is also probably all the time we have for this evening, for this portion of the Q&A. So thank you so much, Dr. Mclaughlin, for these answers. I know we
Can I make one just very quick? So there's a really good question coming up next, which I recognize you don't have time for. I have a couple of chapters in my book on that particular question. So I'd love for whoever, or the three folks who voted the question up about, as a Christian, I don't think the Bible denounces same-sex relationships any more than it supports slavery. Who's to say these two ideas weren't done away with after Jesus? Really important question, and it sort of requires more length to work through that. So I'd love for those folks to get a copy of my book if they're interested to read it.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you for saying that. And if you're interested in continuing to talk with our speaker after this, you can look for a table called the speaker table, and we'll also have a few other tables designated for further Q&A. There'll be crew staff and other leaders there who can help process your questions, or you can just also feel free to stay in the room and continue talking to people who are at your table. So we're always trying to improve the Reason for God series, and we'd love to have your feedback on tonight. Please follow the link in the chat to a Google form that you can fill out. And one thing that some really amazing books that are great for exploring the big questions about God and Christianity, some of which we brought up for you tonight. If you would like a copy, you can pick up in that Google feedback form, and this is an offer we're only making to students at the moment. And some of the books we're offering include Reason for God by Tim Keller, which is the same as the title of this series. How to Be Atheist, I'm Skeptical Enough. Our Deepest Desires, How the Christian Story Fulfills Human Aspirations, which was written by a previous speaker, Dr. Greg. And we are also, as Dr. McLaughlin was mentioning earlier, her book, we're offering Confronting Christianity. And if you'd like to hear more about that book, you can definitely go to the speaker table and she will give a summary and answer additional questions. So our next talk on next Tuesday is going to be by Dr. Jacob Daniel on how can you say that there is only one true faith and how can this be reasonable at 8 p.m. and we'll have a different link, so make sure to check the website reasoningforgod.com for the details on that. Feel free to invite your friends to join, and we're really glad that you were able to join us tonight, and we hope to see you again for the next talk. Again, please join a table after we close this window if you want to stick around and talk to the speaker or some of the others here who can help process your questions. Thank you so much, Dr. McLaughlin, and thank you guys all for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.